Welcome to Story Planet, where every story is a journey of wonder. A teacup full of stars is a tender story, folded notes, evening candlelight, and hearts learning to speak softly in the spaces between words. It's about finding someone who reads you kindly and the slow magic of shared silence, turning into something beautiful. Get cozy, relax, and let the story gently unfold. Perfect for unwinding before the night, or whenever you need a moment of calm. Shall we begin? In the little town of Windale, where the sky always seemed to hold a soft hue of lavender at twilight, and the streets smelled faintly of wood smoke and warm bread, there was a tea-house tucked between a cobbler's shop and an old bookbindery. Its name, carved into a hanging wooden sign, read Marigold and Moon, painted in faded gold letters with tiny hand-painted stars scattered in the corners. It was the kind of place that looked as though it had been waiting for you long before you knew you needed it. The tea house didn't open in the morning like most places. Its lights flickered to life only as the sun began to settle behind the hills, casting a gentle glow across the cobbled streets. Inside, there were always candles flickering in mismatched holders, soft piano music whispering through the corners, and an old clock that ticked just slow enough to make you breathe deeper. That's where Lyra always sat, at the table in the far left corner, beside the window with a view of the ivy-covered wall and the quiet lamplight outside. She had made it a habit over the past 2 years, every Tuesday evening without fail. The staff knew her well enough to bring her favorite tea without asking. Lavender chamomile, served in a pale blue porcelain cup that had the faintest crack near the rim. A delicate scar that seemed to give it character, much like Lyra herself. She was a soft sort of soul, the kind who painted quiet things, like windows in the rain, or the glow of a lamp in fog. She wore sweaters that looked they had stories, carried a canvas satchel filled with notebooks and half-used pens, and had eyes the color of morning light filtered through lace curtains. Lyra came for the peace, the solitude, the way time slowed down when she was surrounded by whispers of steam and cinnamon, the hum of warmth and silence dancing together. She never came with company. She never needed to. But everything began to shift on the third Tuesday of November, when she arrived at her usual time, removed her coat, settled into the soft cushion of her corner seat, and reached for her teacup, only to find something beneath it, a note, folded neatly, pressed flat as if someone had smoothed it carefully. She hesitated. The candle beside her flickered slightly, as if nudging her forward. She unfolded the note with gentle fingers, revealing handwriting that was quiet but sure. "This is the calmest place I've known in years. Thank you for sharing the silence." There was no name, no clue, just those few words and the faint scent of bergamot clinging to the paper. Lyra looked around the room. A couple sat near the fireplace, whispering over a shared pot of chai. An older man with silver hair was reading in the corner. The waitress moved gracefully between tables. No one looked up, no one seemed aware. She folded the note again and slipped it into her sketchbook, unsure whether it was meant for her or whether it mattered. The next Tuesday she returned. The same table, the same tea, the same candlelight wrapping around her like a shawl. And again, another note. The stars don't always shout. Sometimes they whisper just enough for those listening closely. You seem like someone who listens. Her heartbeat, usually soft and steady, skipped once. Then again, it became a rhythm after that. Not every week, but most. Folded papers with thoughtful words, simple poems, questions posed in the form of dreams. Lyra began to reply. She would tuck her responses under the teacup before leaving. "I do listen, mostly to the things that no one else thinks are speaking. Do you believe the moon watches us, or is it only reflecting back what we hope to see? Have you ever heard a memory in a song you've never known? And so it went. Weeks folded into months. Winter snow fell gently outside the window while words blossomed inside. Spring brought lilacs to the windowsill and new thoughts about growth and change. She didn't know his name. She was certain it was a man now, something in the tone, the cadence. But there were no confessions, no desperation, just two souls sharing a space made entirely of soft conversation and trust. She found herself dressing with more care on Tuesdays. Not for show, but for feeling. A sweater that felt like a cloud. Lip balm with honey. A tiny gold pin in the shape of a quill. Sometimes the notes made her laugh. One had read, "Do you think the sugar cubes here are sentient? I swear one winked at me today." Others made her pause and stare out the window. "I used to write until the words hurt too much. Thank you for making them feel like home again." One day in late spring, she left a pressed flower in her reply, tucked between her words like a pause, a gift, a breath. She never saw him, not clearly. A shadow here, a whisper of movement there. Once she thought she caught a glimpse of a man's silhouette reflected in the window across the room, but she never turned, never chased. She didn't want to break the spell. And then came the Tuesday without a note. The teacup sat quietly, no paper beneath, no words, just steam curling upward like a sigh. Lyra sat longer than usual that evening. She stared at the empty saucer, the flicker of her candle, the rain tapping lightly against the window. The music felt distant. Her fingers ached with stillness. She left a note anyway. "You don't have to explain. But you should know. These Tuesdays have become a constellation I follow. I hope you find your sky again." She pressed it under the cup and left with her shoulders wrapped tight, the space beside her heavier than ever. The following week, she returned, heart unsure, hope flickering like the candlelight. Nothing. And then, 3 weeks later, on a soft summer evening filled with the scent of roses and lemon zest, she found something different. The waitress brought her tea and paused. "Someone asked me to give this to you." She handed Lyra a small envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a note, and a tea bag wrapped in silk thread. The note read, "I'm sorry I vanished. I had to go where I thought I'd lost myself. But the truth is, the stars were quieter without you. May I sit with you next Tuesday? No more saucers, just tea. And names." It was signed Julian. She read the name again and again. Julian. The teacup that night held more warmth than any before. Lyra tucked the note into the back of her journal. She held the tea bag in her hand like it was something sacred. Her heart, for the first time in a long time, felt like it had remembered its own name. Outside, twilight deepened. The lamplight blinked on. The ivy outside the window rustled in a breeze, and somewhere, above it all, the stars began to stir. The following Tuesday arrived with the hush of a day holding its breath. The town of Windale was bathed in a golden softness, as though the sun itself had been steeped in honey. Shop fronts glowed with late summer light, and the ivy along the bookstore's walls shimmered gently in the breeze. It was the kind of day that asked for slow footsteps and open hearts. Lyra took her time walking to Marigold and Moon, her sketchbook tucked under one arm, and her pulse quietly dancing in her throat. The note from Julian was still folded neatly in her journal, along with the silken tea bag he'd included. She hadn't dared to brew it yet. It felt like a promise, not just a gesture, a cup meant for two. The teahouse bell chimed gently as she entered, and for a moment the world paused. The candlelight flickered a little brighter. The warm scent of cinnamon and bergamot wrapped around her like a familiar shawl. Her usual table by the window was already set. 2 teacups, 2 chairs, 2 linen napkins folded like whispers. She hesitated, her hand lingering on the back of the chair she always chose, then sat down. A moment later, the waitress approached with a quiet smile. "He's just behind you." Lyra turned. And there he was, Julian. He looked almost exactly as she imagined, tall but with a soft posture, as though he carried more memories than weight. His hair was a gentle, tousled brown with streaks of silver at the temples, and he wore a deep green scarf even in the summer warmth. His eyes met hers with a depth she recognized instantly, the same depth that had poured itself across weeks of folded notes and unspoken dreams. "Hi," he said, with a kind of voice that felt like velvet and rain. "Hi," Lyra replied, her smile unfolding like a flower warmed by light. He sat down slowly, carefully, like entering a sacred space. Neither of them rushed to speak. The moment didn't ask for speed. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Julian said after a pause. "I wasn't sure you would," Lyra admitted, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "But I hoped." Their tea arrived, lavender chamomile for her and Earl Grey for him, the silken tea bag now steeping in his cup like a memory returning home. They didn't dive into questions or demand answers for the months of mystery. Instead, they talked softly. They spoke of music they'd loved and forgotten, favorite constellations, the feeling of being seen in silence. Lyra told him how painting had been her way of speaking when words felt too sharp. Julian confessed that he used to write articles and poems, but stopped after his father's passing, when his words felt too hollow to carry grief. "But your notes," Lyra said gently, "they didn't feel hollow at all." He looked down at his teacup, then back at her. "That's because they weren't for a paper. They were for you." The candle between them danced like it was listening. Over the next hour, they didn't fall in love. They continued falling, softly, the way leaves meet the ground in October, not with noise, but with grace. Julian pulled a small notebook from his satchel and placed it on the table. "I brought this," he said. "It's where I wrote the notes before I copied them onto the parchment." Lyra reached out and gently opened it. Inside were pages filled with ink and small pressed flowers, sketches of teacups, scribbled lines of poetry. One page was dated the night he first saw her. "She sits like a story waiting to be told. I wonder if she knows how her stillness speaks." She felt something bloom inside her that had been waiting for years, something not rushed, not expected, but deeply ready. "I didn't think anyone noticed me like that," she said softly. "I think everyone noticed," Julian replied. "But maybe they didn't listen." They shared a slice of almond cake, the kind that crumbled into softness and left a trail of sweetness on fingertips. When the conversation lulled, they simply sipped their tea and watched the light shift across the window pane. Outside, the sky was turning to velvet. Inside, Lyra felt as if she had been stitched back together, not by dramatic gestures, but by small truths passed between hands and teacups. As they prepared to leave, Julian turned to her. "Would it be all right if I joined you again next week?" Lyra's smile was steady and full. "I was hoping you would." He left a note on the table before they parted, folded, delicate, tucked just beneath the saucer. Later, back home, Lyra unfolded it carefully. "You are not a chapter, Lyra. You are the whole book I didn't know I was writing toward." She placed it between the pages of her sketchbook, beside a dried violet and a quick sketch of 2 teacups nestled together. That night, she slept with the window open, letting in the hum of crickets and a breeze that smelled faintly of Earl Grey. In her dreams, the stars above marigold and moon spelled something quiet and golden. Tea for 2. Hearts 2. And so began a new ritual. Each Tuesday they returned to the same table. Sometimes they spoke of books, sometimes of nothing. Julian would write short lines on napkins, and Lyra would respond with sketches. One week, she drew him holding a lantern made of starlight. He kept it in his coat pocket like a secret. They started walking home together, never in a rush, sometimes not saying a word. One evening, as a gentle rain began to patter on the cobbles, Julian stopped just outside the teahouse. "Do you think," he asked, voice low, "that we've met before in another time?" Lyra looked up at the rain-slicked stars. "No," she said, "but I think we've been waiting for this one." He smiled, the kind of smile that holds 100 unspoken promises. She reached for his hand, and it felt, for the first time, like all the stars had quietly stepped inside their teacups and begun to glow. The wind changed the week after the rain. Not in a dramatic way. There were no thunderclaps or storms, no branches knocked loose or windows shuttered in haste. But those who paid attention to quiet things could feel it. The trees whispered a little slower. The light from the lamplights lingered a bit longer before surrendering to the dark. It was the kind of shift that came not with noise, but with stillness. Lyra felt it in her chest. Not in a way that frightened her, but in the way an artist might feel before painting something honest. An ache of beauty just under the surface, waiting to become. The Tuesday that followed arrived like a sigh of warmth. The town of Windale wore the day gently, its rooftops kissed by soft clouds, its cobblestone streets still damp from the week's earlier drizzle. Lyra, shawl draped over her shoulders, walked with slower steps, cradling her sketchbook to her chest like a letter never sent. Julian was already at the table when she arrived. His scarf hung loosely over the back of his chair, and a worn leather-bound book rested near his teacup, closed but well-loved. He looked up as the bell chimed and smiled the way someone does when they see sunlight break through a cloudy sky. "You came," he said. "I would have come even if the sky were falling," Lyra replied softly. Their tea arrived, hers floral and golden, his rich and dark with a curl of lemon peel floating inside. They clinked cups gently, as they always did, in place of a greeting or goodbye. "I brought something for you," Julian said after a while. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a wrapped bundle tied with a blue ribbon. It was flat, rectangular, and just slightly heavier than paper. Lyra's hands were careful as she unwrapped it. It was a journal. But not just any journal. The cover was deep navy, stitched with tiny embroidered constellations across the front, and her name, Lyra, written in delicate silver thread on the spine. She touched it with reverence. "It's yours," he said, "for the words you haven't yet written, or the ones you've been afraid to." Lyra blinked against the warmth behind her eyes. "No one's ever given me something like this." Julian looked down at his teacup, turning it slowly. "I know what it feels like to be full of stories and still feel like you have nowhere safe to place them." The teahouse seemed to fall quieter around them. Lyra opened the journal to the first page. There in Julian's handwriting were the words, "This book belongs to the girl who turned tea into poetry and quiet into a symphony." She looked up, her heart pressed softly between her ribs. "You remember things beautifully," she whispered. "I only write them the way you make them feel." They didn't talk much more that night. They didn't need to. Instead, they sat with the comfort of knowing, the silence between them filled with golden threads that didn't require untangling. Lyra spent the rest of the week writing. Not long essays or complicated reflections, just fragments, little moments, poems half finished, but full of truth. She wrote about the way Julian's laugh rumbled like distant thunder, about the way her candlelight flickered stronger when she remembered him. She sketched leaves pressed against the window, his teacup held in steady hands, the shadows their elbows cast across the table. She brought the journal back the next Tuesday. Julian smiled when she placed it in front of him. You filled it already? Almost. He leafed through the pages slowly, pausing every few lines, his expression softening. At one page, he stopped. It was a drawing of a bench beneath a tree. A pair of teacups sat on the armrest between them. Above the scene, she had written, "If I could plant us somewhere, I'd choose here, where the seasons are kind and the stars remember us." Julian closed the journal gently. "I have something to show you too," he said. He pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. Lyra opened it with slow fingers, revealing a photograph, a black and white image, slightly faded. Two children, a boy and a girl, sitting at a picnic table under a tree, laughing, teacups between them. She looked up. "That's me," she whispered. Julian nodded. "And me. I don't remember this. I found it last week in a box of old family photos," Julian said. "I had forgotten it too, until you smiled that first night I walked in here, and I remembered the sound of laughter under leaves." Lyra placed her hand over her heart. "Maybe we don't meet people for the first time," she said. "Maybe we just come back to them." Julian reached across the table and took her hand. The candle between them didn't flicker. It glowed. Later that evening, as they walked through the winding streets of Windale, the stars blinked softly above, watching like they always had. They stopped near the old wishing well in the town square. Lyra dropped in a coin. "What did you wish for?" Julian asked. "That I'd never have to wish alone again." He leaned down and kissed her cheek. "You won't." The journal, the photograph, the tea, they were all just pieces. But together they became a story. A story not written in grand gestures, but in gentle moments shared over candlelight and porcelain, between the sips of two people learning to love softly. Back at home, Lyra placed the journal on her shelf beside a candle and a small ceramic moon. She lit the wick and watched it flicker, a quiet fire echoing the one in her chest. She picked up her pen and wrote, "There are stories we live and stories we find, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find someone who reads us kindly." Outside, the wind stirred gently. The world was changing. But inside Marigold and Moon, the story was just beginning to settle into its warmest pages. Time, in the village of Windale, moved gently. It didn't sweep by in gusts or gallop through the days. It drifted, the way candlelight moves across a wall, soft and golden, barely noticed until you realize the shadows have shifted. And so the weeks passed, not in a rush, but in rhythm. A heartbeat of teacups clinking, pens scratching, laughter shared in the hush between stories. Julian and Lyra began meeting beyond the teahouse. Mornings in the garden behind the bookbindery, afternoons in the library's poetry corner, curled up beside the dusty shelves. On Thursdays, they walked through the old park where trees leaned in like listeners, and the path curved toward a bench that now bore their names carved in careful script. J&L, beneath the stars. They didn't speak of forever. They didn't need to. Because in every glance, in every shared silence, was the understanding that something timeless had found them. Julian began writing again. Not for publishers, not for deadlines, but for joy. Short stories, some no longer than a page. He'd leave them folded like origami boats at the cafe for strangers to find. Lyra illustrated the margins, tiny watercolor moons, cups of tea, moths fluttering between constellations. They began a journal together. One page hers, the next his. A line from Lyra. "Today I saw you through the steam of your tea, and you looked like something I dreamed once." A reply from Julian. "If I were a dream, I hope I'm the kind that lingers into morning." And then came autumn. The leaves in Windale turned amber and rust, carpeting the streets and stories waiting to be stepped on. Marigold and Moon began serving spiced plum tea and oat scones with honey drizzle. The fireplace crackled a bit louder. Evenings came sooner. One Tuesday, Julian arrived carrying a small parcel wrapped in craft paper, tied with twine and a sprig of dried lavender. Lyra looked up, curious. "You always bring things that smell like poetry," she teased. Julian grinned. "Open it." Inside was a small wooden box with tiny brass clasp. She opened it slowly. Inside, a ceramic teacup, handmade, slightly imperfect, deep navy glaze flecked with tiny silver stars. Around the rim, painted in delicate lettering, "The quietest yes." Lyra looked up, eyes wide. Julian leaned forward. "This isn't a proposal, not yet, but it's a beginning, a promise, that I'll show up for every Tuesday, every stargazing walk, every silence you need me to share." She blinked once, twice, then placed her hand gently over his. "It's already a yes," she whispered. They sat that way for a long time, 2 and 1,000 starlit moments nestled between them. Winter followed. The village wore white like a storybook illustration. Snow dusted the window panes of the teahouse, and the lamplight glowed amber through the frost. Julian and Lyra bundled in scarves and shared mittens. She taught him how to paint snowflakes. He taught her how to write a sonnet. One evening, as they watched the snow fall from the teahouse window, Lyra asked, "Do you ever wonder why this place feels like magic?" Julian nodded. "Because it holds the quiet things, and quiet things are sacred." They finished their tea in silence. Outside, a child ran past, laughing. A dog barked softly. Somewhere a bell rang midnight. Lyra reached into her bag and pulled out the journal they'd been writing in together. She opened to a blank page. "Let's write one more," she said. They bent over the table, hands brushing as they wrote. Together, line by line. We were not a spark. We were the slow flame, the ember that waits, that warms, that stays. When they finished, Julian looked up. "Shall we keep going?" Lyra smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I thought we already were." The candle on their table burned a little brighter, as if it had been waiting for that line. That winter, Lyra moved into the little stone cottage just 2 lanes over from Julian's. They still met at Marigold and Moon, still sat at the same table, though now the waitress smiled with extra fondness as she served their tea. They built a bookshelf together. The first book placed there was their journal. The second, a book of fairy tales Lyra had loved as a child. The third, Julian's collection of stories, the ones he never published, but shared with her alone. On New Year's Eve, the village held its lantern walk. People gathered with paper lanterns and tea lights, walking through the snow-covered paths, placing their lanterns along the riverbank. Julian and Lyra held theirs together. Inside was a slip of parchment, written in both their hands. For all the Tuesdays that turned into always. They placed it gently on the water and watched it float, glowing down the quiet river. Later that night, curled on the sofa, Lyra whispered, "You know, I used to think love had to be loud, like thunder, like fireworks." Julian brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "And now? Now I know it's candlelight. A steady kettle, a folded note under a teacup." He kissed her forehead, and a yes so quiet only the stars could hear it. Outside, snow fell like pages from a book written in hush. Inside, 2 cups sat empty, still warm. And between them, the story kept writing itself, not with fanfare, but with heart. With home, with love. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this gentle journey through folded notes and candlelit corners, consider giving it a thumbs up and sharing it with your loved ones. Perhaps they too are waiting for a quiet story to find them. For daily stories of calm, subscribe if you haven't already. Good night and sweet dreams from Story Planet.